think about Sparta, you probably picture strong men with round shields and spears, shouting before facing thousands of enemies. That image is not wrong, but it hides a much more disturbing truth about what really happened in that ancient Greek city-state. The Spartans were not just well-trained warriors. They were the product of a system that transformed children into killing machines, eliminating any trace of weakness or individuality from birth. And the scariest part is not that this happened thousands of years ago, but that the logic behind this system is still alive today, just with a different disguise. Sparta existed between the 9th and 2nd centuries before Christ in southern Greece, in a region called Laconia. While other Greek cities like Athens worried about philosophy, theater, and democracy, Sparta had a single goal: to create the most efficient military force the world had ever seen. And they succeeded. For centuries, the Spartans were considered invincible in battle. But this success came at an extremely high price, and that price was paid from the moment a child was born. When a baby came into the world in Sparta, it did not go straight home with its parents. The elders of the city examined the newborn to see if it was strong enough to survive. If the baby seemed weak, sick, or had any kind of physical problem, it was taken to Mount Taygetus and left there to die. This was not seen as cruelty. For the Spartans, it was just practical. A society that depended completely on military strength could not afford to feed mouths that would not contribute to war. This election at birth already shows how little human life was worth in Sparta if it did not serve the collective purpose. If the baby passed that first test, it had a few years of relatively normal life with the family. But at 7 years old, everything changed. Boys were taken from home and sent to the agoge, which was a Spartan education and military training system. And here we are not talking about a normal school. The agoge was a brutal training camp that lasted until 30 years of age. During those 23 years, boys learned only one thing: how to become perfect warriors. There were no math classes, art, or literature. There was only fighting, pain, and survival. Training began with deprivation. Children received just enough food to not starve to death. The idea was that they would learn to steal food without getting caught. But if they were caught stealing, they were not punished for stealing. They were punished for having been caught, for not having been efficient enough. This taught children that cheating and deceiving was acceptable as long as you were good at it. Morality did not matter. What mattered was the ability to survive and win. Children slept on beds made of rushes, which they had to harvest themselves. In winter, they broke the rushes with their bare hands to create a layer that would warm up a bit more. They were beaten regularly, not as punishment for something specific, but just to toughen them up. The Spartans believed that constant pain made boys more resistant, more capable of enduring the horrors of war. And indeed, it worked. An adult Spartan could endure injuries that would make other men faint from pain. At 12 years old, boys went through a ritual called diamastagosis, where they were whipped until they bled in front of an altar. Some died during this ritual. Those who survived were considered worthy. The more pain you could endure without screaming or begging for mercy, the more respect you earned. The ability to endure extreme suffering was the most valuable currency in Sparta. This created a culture where showing weakness, even for a second, could mean your complete social destruction. But the cruelest aspect of the Spartan system was perhaps the krypteia. When young Spartans reached 20 years old, some were selected to participate in this rite of passage. They were sent to the countryside with only a knife and instructed to survive on their own. But survival was not the real goal. The goal was to kill. Sparta maintained a huge population of slaves called helots, who worked the land and did all the work that Spartans considered unworthy. The helots outnumbered the Spartans, and this scared the rulers. So during the krypteia, young Spartans were instructed to hunt and kill helots during the night. Not helots who had committed crimes, just helots who seemed too strong or too intelligent, who could represent a future threat. Think about what that means. 20-year-old teenagers were trained to murder innocent people just to prove they were cold enough to do it without hesitation. And this was not seen as murder. It was seen as training. The Spartan system not only accepted cruelty, it required it. A Spartan who showed pity or compassion was considered weak, unfit to protect the city. Empathy was treated as a character flaw that needed to be eliminated. Spartan women had a somewhat different life, but not necessarily better. They did not go to the agoge, but they went through intense physical training. The logic was that strong women would produce strong children. They had more freedom than women in other Greek cities, could own property, and were encouraged to exercise and compete. But this freedom came with a heavy expectation: to produce warriors. If a Spartan woman could not give birth to healthy children, she was seen as a failure. Her value was directly linked to her reproductive capacity. Now, why does all this matter to us today? Why should anyone care about what happened in an ancient city thousands of years ago? The answer is simple: because the Spartan mentality never really died. It just changed form. Sparta may have disappeared, but the idea that you need to torture yourself to have value is still here, stronger than ever. Think about modern entrepreneurship culture. How many times have you seen someone on social media talking about waking up at 5 in the morning, working out before sunrise, working 16 hours a day, and sacrificing weekends to win? That mentality is the same as the Spartans. The idea that suffering makes you superior, that relaxing is weakness, that you need to always be in combat mode. People today pride themselves on sleeping 4 hours a night, skipping meals to work more, not taking vacations. They treat their own bodies like the Spartans did, a tool that needs to be pushed beyond limits, even if it means destroying it in the process. Extreme fitness culture is another clear example. I am not talking about people who exercise for health. I am talking about those who transform their bodies into battlefields, who feel proud of training until they vomit, of continuing even with injuries, of following diets that barely provide enough energy to function. This obsession with pushing the body beyond what is reasonable comes from the same source: the belief that you only have value if you can endure more pain than others. And just like in Sparta, showing weakness, admitting that you are tired or that you need rest, is treated as shameful. Look at the competitive education system that exists in many places. Children are placed in competition from an early age, learning that their value lies in grades, trophies, how much they can stand out from their peers. Friendship and collaboration are secondary. What matters is winning. And those who cannot keep up the pace, who have difficulties or learn differently, are left behind, just like the weak babies on Mount Taygetus. Children who do not fit the mold are discarded by the system, not literally, of course, but through exclusion, bullying, the constant message that they are not good enough. Modern corporate culture also carries Spartan traits. Companies that glorify the idea of high-performance culture, where employees compete with each other for promotions, where overtime is not just expected but required, where taking sick leave is viewed with suspicion. The ideal employee in this system is one who sacrifices everything for the company, who puts work above family, health, their own sanity. And those who cannot maintain this pace are eliminated, fired, replaced by someone younger and willing to destroy themselves for the promise of success. The Spartan krypteia also has its modern equivalents. Think about how societies treat groups they consider threatening. The logic is the same. Identify who could represent danger in the future and neutralize that threat before it materializes. This appears in extreme surveillance policies, in justice systems that imprison people for crimes they have not yet committed, in discourses that dehumanize certain groups to justify violence against them. The difference is that today we have prettier words to describe these practices. We call it national security, prevention, protection. But the logic is the same that sent young Spartans to kill slaves in the dead of night. Another disturbing parallel is in how we deal with vulnerability. Sparta had no room for weakness. If you got injured in battle and could no longer fight, you lost your status. If you showed fear, you were ridiculed. If you asked for help, you were seen as inferior. And today, men are taught from an early age that crying is for women, that asking for psychological help is weakness, that admitting you are not okay is shameful. This refusal to accept vulnerability causes enormous damage. People suffer in silence, develop serious mental problems, sometimes even take their own lives, all because they have internalized the message that showing you are human, that you have limits, is unacceptable. Social media has amplified this in a frightening way. Everyone is performing strength all the time. Nobody posts about the day they stayed in bed with depression. They post about the perfect morning routine, the intense workout, the success at work. This creates an invisible competition where everyone is trying to prove they are stronger, more disciplined, more capable than others. And just like in the agoge, the punishment for not keeping up is social exclusion. If you are not constantly showing that you are winning, you are forgotten, ignored, considered irrelevant. The tragic irony of all this is that Sparta, despite all its cruelty and military strength, eventually fell. The city that dedicated itself completely to war ended up being defeated and forgotten. Why? Because a system that treats people like machines, that eliminates compassion and individuality, that values only brute strength, is unsustainable in the long run. Sparta did not produce art that lasted centuries. It did not create philosophy that changed the world. It left no inventions or scientific discoveries. All Sparta did was create warriors, and when those warriors lost battles, nothing remained. And that is exactly what is happening today with people who follow this mentality. They destroy themselves in the name of productivity, strength, success. And when they finally stop, whether from burnout, illness, or simply because they can no longer continue, they realize they have not built anything that really matters. They have no deep relationships because they were too busy competing. They have no hobbies or interests because everything was about winning. They have no health because they sacrificed their bodies on the altar of performance. The Spartan system also reveals something fundamental about how societies work. Sparta managed to maintain its cruel system because everyone believed it was necessary. The Spartans genuinely thought that without this brutality, they would be destroyed by enemies. They saw cruelty not as evil, but as a pragmatic necessity. And that is scary because it shows how easy it is to normalize horrors when you convince people there is no alternative. Today, we see the same logic being used. If you do not work 60 hours a week, someone will take your place. If you're not always improving, you are falling behind. If you show weakness, people will use you. These messages create a state of constant fear, where people think they have no choice but to participate in brutal competition. But just like Sparta, this is a path that leads only to destruction. The inconvenient truth that nobody wants to hear is that you do not need to torture yourself to have value. You do not need to prove anything by pushing your body and mind beyond healthy limits. Rest is not laziness. Asking for help is not weakness. Admitting that you have limits does not make you inferior. These are lies that systems like Sparta sell to keep people functioning like machines. And the sooner you realize this, the sooner you can escape this trap. The Spartans were cruel not because they were inherently evil, but because they built a system that required cruelty to function. And they perpetuated that system generation after generation, each one believing it was the only way to survive. But in the end, all that cruelty did not save Sparta. It only ensured that when the city fell, nothing would remain to remember except stories about how well they knew how to kill. So when you see someone glorifying the Spartan mentality, when you hear speeches about extreme discipline and constant sacrifice, remember what really happened in Sparta. Remember the children left to die, the teenagers beaten until they bled, the young people forced to kill innocents to prove their coldness. And ask yourself if that is what you want for your life. Because in the end, you can choose not to participate in this madness. You can decide that your humanity, your capacity to feel and care and rest, is worth more than any trophy or recognition that comes from destroying yourself.